And welcome back. So just to kind of catch up on things that have taken place since the last video, we went ahead and got the exhaust manifolds rebolted on. Like I said in the last video, I didn't record it because it's literally just putting on a couple bolts on each side, tighten them up. So the lower exhaust is hooked up to the exhaust manifold in both cylinders. We went ahead and rebolted back in the front drive shaft, and we also dropped the oil filter. Put a fresh oil filter on things. May not be able to see it, but we did use a Wix oil filter. Ran a little bit of sacrificial oil through the engine with the oil plug out and just kind of let it flow a little bit. Put our plug back in and we topped off our oil while we're at it. So we're to the point now we just want to put a vacuum on the cooling system, verify that it can get to that vacuum and hold that vacuum. And as long as it can hold that vacuum for, I would say, probably at least 5 to 10 minute time frame, then we'll work on getting our coolant mixed up and start to use that same device to fill. So if you've watched our 6.4 video, what's going to happen here is it uses a Venturi type device where we're going to feed shop air in, and as it's directing that shop air out through this valve, it'll cause a vacuum effect to take place off of our radiator adapter through this hose, and it'll start to pull the air out of the system. And we should even start to see these radiator hoses collapse as this takes place. Then once we have a vacuum in the system, we'll cut this valve off, turn our shop air off, and then we'll mix up a gallon of coolant and then feed it in, because we'll have our bucket a little bit higher than the state of our reservoir so it can pull in. And then we'll open this valve slowly to then utilize that vacuum to draw coolant in the system. And by doing this, it'll help us eliminate the possibility of having air pockets and things of that nature, because we're getting ready to evac all the air out of the system. What we're using for coolant is Mopar's 5-year coolant. This truck originally came with 5-year coolant. Mopar also makes a 10-year coolant, and this is also the concentrated variety. So we'll be mixing 1 gallon of this coolant to 1 gallon of distilled water, giving us our 50-50 mix. Now the best price on this I actually found was on Rock Auto, and the other reason why I like to get the concentrate is that typically you almost spend, if you get the pre-diluted container, you spend the same amount of money for pre-diluted as you do concentrate. Now the nice thing is pre-diluted, it's ready to go, there's no mixing. The nice thing about the concentrate is, you know, as you mix each gallon, you're actually getting 2 gallons of coolant because you're adding a gallon of distilled water. So for the same price, yeah, you have to mix it, but you're getting, you know, 2 gallons instead of 1. But since this truck originally came with 5-year coolant in it, we're going to put 5-year coolant back in it again when we go to do our fill. So what we're going to concentrate on now is getting a vacuum drawn on this system. Once we get that in place, I'll bring it back to you and show you the needle. I'm not going to film it as it's doing this, because this is going to be a pretty loud process, because we're feeding about 80 psi with the air through this system in order to generate that vacuum. So I'm going to get to work on this. Once that's done, I'll bring you back. Thank you much. Okay, and we're back. You can see that we've got our needle almost kind of at -20. In the book said anywhere between -20 and 25. I'm going to stop there because we're just inside of the yellow mark, so I'm going to let that sit, because the same thing we did on the 6.4. I'm going to let this sit here for about a good 5, maybe 10 minutes and see if it comes down any. But to show you, it did take 3 or 4 goes of letting the compressor fill at the tank again, because it isn't quite big enough to do all that in one go, but it can get the job done. At the end, I think we were putting right about 100 pounds of pressure through this gauge cluster here to be able to get that to drop. So, but I'm going to let this sit here, and then I'll bring you back. Thank you much. Okay, so we're about 5 minutes in. You can see our needle hasn't moved. And the cool thing was, and I forgot to do this, was apparently, at least on this model, you don't have to block off the overfill. I guess this adapter cap must compensate for that. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and get a piece of tape before we start filling and just tape over that, just in case the coolant starts going. I mean, we know we're working, we know we're getting our vacuum, because I forgot to show that to you. You see that top radiator hose? It's nice and collapsed, and hopefully you can see that bottom one there. It's nice and sandwich flat as well. So we definitely drove a vacuum on the system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get this mixed up 1 gallon or 2 gallons at a time. So 1 gallon of concentrate, 1 gallon distilled. And this is our siphon hose, or a suction hose I should say, that's going to fill. It's got a little weighted brass fitting with a screen on it. We're going to put that in our bucket, and I'm just going to use this valve manually, and just kind of keep an eyeball on it and just crack it and keep an eyeball on the coolant level. And as we start to deplete this 2 gallons we're getting ready to mix up, then I'll shut this off and I'll mix a gallon, because what I don't want to do is mix, you know, 6 gallons of coolant, because I don't need quite all 6 gallons of coolant to fill this. So I just want to take it a couple gallons at a time until we get it filled. And you'll know we're filled when we completely run out of vacuum and we're back down to 0. Now the system will still need a top off at that point, but once we get that done, you know, I mean, we'll take this off, we'll put our overflow tank, we'll reattach our overflow tank's tube, and then we'll put some coolant in here, so as we run this for the first time and it heats up, it's got a source to draw from. So I'm going to get the mix in this coolant. I'm going to get something to cover our little overflow here, just in case, and then I'll bring you back. Thank you much. And welcome back. So I got you on a little tripod here. Hopefully you can see things okay. We're going to start the fill process on this. And actually what I'm going to do first is just go ahead and take the shop air off. There we go. And then we'll slowly open up this bottom valve and start bringing coolant in the system, and you'll start to see this vacuum gauge start to go down. We'll start to lose our vacuum. And there we go, we're filling. So this is what we're going to do for the next few minutes here. I'll leave the camera on, and you should start to see this. Yeah, you can see that needle just starting to finally come off a vacuum at this point, and I can hear it starting to fill the system, which is interesting. How are we looking in our bucket? We're still doing good? Okay, let me know when that starts to get a little bit low, because we don't want it to suck air. Okay, I'm going to turn it up so you can see that. You see that needle drop right there? You can see we're coming down a little bit. So I'm going to cut the camera at this point. We're going to do this for the next couple minutes, and I'll bring you back. Thank you much. And welcome back. So we got done with our vacuum and purge and fill system, and we're just topping off the radiator now and the coolant tank. So we took what was left in our bucket and just poured it back in the jug, and looks like we're going to end up just shy of 6 gallons of coolant total that we've mixed up to add it in. Now obviously when we run it, any residual air that might still be in the system, so some of that coolant may get taken up, and you can kind of see it's still settling down in there just a little bit. So I got to put a little bit more in there to finish topping it up. But what I thought was interesting, and what I wanted to show you, was that let me add a little bit more coolant into this, and you'll see what I mean. Watch this. You probably noticed it when we were mixing it in the bucket, but it's pink as we were mixing it, as we were putting it in the radiator. There we go. Now our radiator's topped off, and just because of the way the light hits this kind of stuff is interesting. You notice it kind of looks more orange in that shot than it does pink. I noticed that when we were working on the 6.4 as well, that I don't know, it's just something with this. I think this is an HOAT coolant or an OAT coolant. It's either an organic acid technology or a hybrid organic acid technology. One of the two, I can't remember which, but it's just, I've noticed it before. It can actually look different colors and different shades of light, which is, you know, interesting. So I'm going to top the radiator off a little bit. We got about our coolant reservoir here, a little over half full. And once we get this done, we'll put a cap on it. We'll bring you back for the main event, which is seeing if we can get this thing to crank after all this work. What we're going to do first is we're going to leave the fuel pump fuse out. We're going to crank it over a couple of times and wait and see if we can at least get it to build some oil pressure before we put the fuel pump fuse in. Then we'll do that, let it prime, let it fill the fuel rail, and then it will be time for the main event. But we'll bring you back in a bit. Thank you much. Bye. And welcome back. So a little correction on what I told you earlier. What I said earlier was that we finished with a little over 6 gallons of coolant. That was incorrect. We're actually a little over 4 gallons of coolant at this point. We did end up mixing the other 2 gallons of coolant and putting them in the containers. That way we've got a 50-50 premix ready to go. So when we start this up and then let it cool down, we'll open up our radiator cap at that point once it's cool and see if we need to add anything else to the system. But we've got a battery attached, which you can't see, it's slightly off out of frame. Went ahead and put our air filter back on, our inlet air temperature sensor. So all of our electrical connections are done at this point. We still have our fuel pump fuse out, and we're going to leave it out. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go in the cab, and I'm going to just key cycle it a couple of times. So it'll attempt to start for maybe 10-15 seconds. Obviously it won't be successful, but while it's doing that, we're going to be listening for any obviously mechanical noises that shouldn't be there. But I'm going to keep my eye on the oil pressure and wait and see that at least come up a little bit. And then when it does, we'll get the fuel pump fuse in there and we'll proceed forward. But I got you on tripod right now, just kind of downward shot of the front of the engine, so if anything comes flying out of it, you know, hopefully it'll be a pretty good show. Okay, so we have low pressure at this point. I'm going to get the fuel pump fuse in, put it in, and we'll go on. So I'm going to key cycle it a couple of times and just let it build some fuel pressure, and then I'll try it. Okay, here we go. pressure at idle, which isn't bad. Looks like we may have a little bit of a stumble. She's shaking a little bit, but that may just take time for that to kind of work itself out. The brain has been unplugged for quite some time, so it's going to take a little bit for it to learn everything. But at least it's no longer running like a steam engine. Show you that we are smoking out the exhaust, but we expect that. If you remember, we had a lot of oil in the cylinders as we were leaving things lubricated. Plus we probably got some water down in the exhaust with taking the heads off. That should clear out here over time. So we'll let that run for a little bit. Yeah, and you can see our shaking it's calming down. It's coming down to a much more normal rhythm. Let me get you a shot of the inside of the dash here. You can see, hopefully you can see that okay. Let's get you in there. 76 pounds of oil pressure right now at idle. So we're doing good there. And yeah, we got traction control and a couple other things, but we know that because we still have speed sensors and stuff we need to sort out. Looks like we're running about 700 RPMs, which is perfectly normal. So we're going to let this run for a little bit while longer and kind of get up to temperature, and then we'll go from there. Give you another shot around the front here. Smoking is starting to calm down a little bit out of the tailpipe. You can see some more smoke coming up here, and again, that's just all that WD-40 and stuff that was on the exhaust that's starting to burn off. You can see that we're calming down quite a bit. I don't hear any lifter ticks, any lower end ticks. That's good. The only clicking I hear right now sounds like it's coming from the fuel injectors, which is perfectly normal. This bad boy is running like a top. So we're gonna cut the video at this point. We're gonna let it run and come up to temperature. Then we'll cut it, let it cool down, and once it's cooled down, we'll check how our coolant level's looking. With that being said, I'll let you go and I'll bring you back. Thank you much. So welcome back. So we got a little bit more work to do yet. You can see that little bit of a stumble that's still in there. And if you look at our misfire count, it looks like we got cylinder 1 still has an active misfire on it. But we're much improved, but unfortunately we're gonna have to diagnose what's going on with that cylinder. Obviously the easiest thing is going to be to do is to let it cool and take the spark plug pack. We'll actually pull one off the parts truck behind us, change it out with this one, and see if our misfire goes away or stays. If it stays, then we'll have to do a compression test on that cylinder and just verify, and hopefully we don't have to tear it all back apart again. Again, just normal troubleshooting steps, but you can see that we're actively running a lot better than what we were, but we still have an issue with that number 1 cylinder. The air conditioning's also not wanting to kick on, but again, we went into this knowing that once we had the engine sorted out, there was going to be other stuff that we obviously couldn't test until we had a functional engine, so we'll have to look at that as well. Now I'm happy with I know the upper end work as far as the mechanical push rods, valve springs and everything of that nature should be okay. So it may just be an issue of a bad coil pack, or it could just be a messed up injector. But again, we'll have to get in there and kind of see what's going on. We can easily test for power and ignition signal on that connector, and if we do, then we know our wiring's okay. But like I said, we'll start with swapping the cylinder. We'll start with swapping the coil pack first, since it's the easiest, and we'll go from there. But that'll have to be in a different video. But as you can see, we're running. Yeah, we got a number 1 cylinder issue that we need to track down, but it's better to have to track down 1 misfiring cylinder and not 4 or 6 like we were getting before. With that being said, I'm going to categorize this as about a 90% success, and I'll bring you back when we start tearing into this again and see what's going on with our number 1 cylinder there. Until then, I'll talk to you later. Bye. And welcome back. So we went the quick route of just grabbing another coil pack and putting it on cylinder 1 there. And you can see it didn't help our issue. It did momentarily, it cleared the fault code, but you can see right after it come down from idle, it's starting to act up again. So we've got, still have some kind of issue with cylinder 1 at this point. So since we did check the coil for power as well as signal from the PCM to fire, and it's getting both of that. So since we know we have good power, we know that we have good signal, and we know that the coil is good because we took it off a knowingly good engine, then that would mean that the next thing we need to do is do a compression test and find out what is going on with that cylinder. So if the compression test is good, then it's going to get interesting. Then the next thing we need to look at is the injector. In other words, is the injector good? Are we getting fuel for that to fire? And we can actually do a quick injector test with the engine off to see how we fare. And I'll probably do that next, just to see if we hear an audible click. Now I think the injector's working, because when you first start it, you don't get the misfire until you come down to idle, which you see here. So we're going to do a couple more things to this, and then I'm going to cut the video at this point. Like I said, the engine's in a running state. Now we're just in a troubleshooting state of what this issue in the number 1 cylinder could be. So I'm going to let you go at this point, and I'll bring you back for the next one. Thank you much. Bye. And welcome back. So I just want to do a little bit of a summary on kind of what has transpired to this point. As you saw, the engine runs. Unfortunately, as you also saw, we have a cylinder 1 misfire when the engine comes down to idle. We've already diagnosed that the coil control and voltage is good. We see voltage at the coil. We see the PCM commanding the coil to fire. We've also tried changing the coil out with one from the from the donor, the 2012 Ram 1500 behind the garage. It didn't help. So we know the coil is good from a knowing good one. We know we got knowing good power. We've got knowing good control. And we still get a misfire when it comes down to idle. So I think the key there is cylinder 1 doesn't misfire at high RPMs, only when it comes down to idle, which to me kind of screams of a potential compression issue. And also, and I didn't show this in the video, because as I'm going over the scan tool and looking at all the counters, as I'm revving up and noticing that cylinder 1 stops misfiring, cylinder 7 starts misfiring. So if you remember, cylinder 7 was the one that also had a bent intake valve. And although we did look at the sleeve that was in there, and everything felt good, the valve was free floating, it wasn't hanging up, it could mean, and we did test the cylinder heads when we had the valves lapped and installed, you know, it wasn't, and we put some fluid in each of the bores and none of that fluid leaked out. Everything seemed stable. But if it stops misfiring at, if it starts to misfire at high RPMs, it could very well be that maybe it's not actuating the valves open far enough like it's supposed to, or there's other engine damage, could be piston rings. So just going back to cylinder 1, since it happens with the engine coming down the idle, it recreates itself fairly easy. Since we know it's not power to the coil, we know it's not control of the coil, and we know it's not the coil itself because we switched it out and the problem didn't go away. That leaves us a fuel injector, which I don't think it's a fuel injector, but we're still going to test it because remember that fuel rail and all those injectors came off a knowingly good running 5.7 Hemi. So with that being said, we need to do a compression test of cylinder 1. And then we're going to need to do a leak down test. Now I'm going to have to either buy a leak down tester or purchase a, I'm sorry, not buy one, or just go rent a leak down tester, one of the two, and put some compressed, basically have it measure for us if the piston rings are shot in 1 and 7 at this point. So we need to do a compression test in 1 and 7. We need to do a leak down test in 1 and 7. And if all of that comes back good and the fuel injectors are toggling like they're supposed to be toggling, and I'll test that because that's easy enough to do with the scan tool. We can actuate those injectors. We can also take it a step further and put the original fuel rail or fuel adapter on there, so we can put our pressure gauge on there, let the fuel pump run, get the fuel rev pressure on there, and then actuate cylinders 1 and 7 injectors and just verify that the fuel pressure falls the same amount between the two, and that'll tell us that our injectors are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Now we know it's not we can safely, and I don't want to assume, but we can safely say that, do we think it's a sealing issue or anything of that nature? No, because everything went on okay, you know, all new gaskets, you know, so on and so forth. All the smoking stopped in the tailpipe, you know, it's not running rich anymore. It's not reeking of gas when you run it. You're not seeing any white smoke showing like unburnt fuel. No white smoke out of the tailpipe. So again, it doesn't look like it's burning raw fuel. It doesn't look like it's burning water. So it doesn't look like that we've got a leaky head gasket or anything. So that's why we need to do the compression test on 1 and 7 and also do the leak down test. Now, if the compression test is good and the leak down test is bad, then that's going to tell us that our piston rings are wiped at that point. And if they're wiped, we'll pull the motor. We have no choice. What we'll do is we'll pull the donor motor out of the 2012. We'll get it in here on an engine stand, and we'll start the tear down process on it and get it built back up. Even though it doesn't need it, we're going to do it anyway. We'll go ahead and pop a cam in it. We'll pop lifters in it, and then push rods. So we'll do a very similar upper engine rebuild on the 2012. Get it all prepped, all ready to go within the comfort of our garage, and then we'll pull the one out of the TRX and drop this one into its place. So with that being said, unfortunately, like I said, it was a success and a failure. A success in that it runs, but a failure in the sense that we still have an intermittent misfire on 1 and 7. So take that with a grain of salt. I appreciate you sticking around listening to this long rambling session. But if you haven't considered subscribing, please consider to do so, because as you saw, we've got a lot more videos to come. We need to get this engine squared away because we need to start tackling the other issues that are also wrong with that TRX. And also just because guess what I'm saying is if you haven't considered subscribing, please consider to do so. We're really trying to get to that 1,000 member count. We got a lot more content to come, especially if we get into, you know, pulling motors and doing build-ups and dropping motors back in again. So that being said, I appreciate you sticking around for this long rambling session. And I don't consider it a complete failure because we were able to get it to run. We were able to massively increase our knowledge content of a 5.7 that we could definitely use into the future. But you know, here's hoping that we can possibly bring this engine around. But like I said, a compression test and a leak down test, I think at this point is going to tell us definitively either A, where to go next, or that the engine is toast at this point. But I'm going to call this a video at this point, and I'll bring you back for the next one. And like I said, I'm not going to give up on it. I'm not ready to give up on it at this point. And we shall see. And thank you much.